Craig Williams is a Republican candidate for Pennsylvania Attorney General. Why are you running for this office?
Yeah, it's a great question. I start usually with my background. I am a 28-year retired Marine Corps colonel. I did about 16 years on active duty. I was educated at Duke University in the Navy ROTC program, went off to fly jets. I was a naval flight officer, the guy in back of an F-18, fought in Desert Storm, then went to law school on a Marine Corps program, was the chief prosecutor at Camp Pendleton. Later, I was recalled back to active duty. I was deputy legal counsel to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, both General Myers and General Pace, a federal prosecutor in Denver, a federal prosecutor in Philadelphia. I have uniquely the best set of qualifications to do this. You asked me why. And the why is people are dying in Pennsylvania. Maybe not in every corner, but in every large city right now, we've got a style of progressive prosecution that is endangering the lives of Pennsylvanians. And I've been fighting for most of my adult life to keep people safe. And that's why I decided to step forward to run for Attorney General. I'm tired of Republicans losing. And I'm running in a part of the world where Republicans are losing and I keep winning. And I'm going to bring that winning narrative to this race.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the Office of Attorney General itself. Talk about its jurisdictions, what types of criminal activities it's involved in.
Yeah, great question. So typically speaking, in the 67 counties, it's the district attorneys who have exclusive jurisdiction to prosecute most crimes. There are some crimes for which the Attorney General's office has concurrent jurisdiction. By way of an example, in 2022, I orchestrated an effort to reauthorize concurrent jurisdiction for Josh Shapiro to prosecute gun crime in Philadelphia. He had concurrent jurisdiction up to that point. He would famously go to TV and say, when people were dying in Philadelphia, that the reason people were dying in Philadelphia is because of Republicans in Harrisburg. And I challenged that and said, no, he has concurrent jurisdiction to prosecute too. The reason people are dying is because we don't prosecute crime. So in terms of the jurisdiction of the Attorney General's office, that is set legislatively. And I will be seeking concurrent jurisdiction to go into these large cities and prosecute violent crime, namely felons in possession of guns. It is a federal and a state crime for a previously convicted felon to possess a gun, even for an instance. And I will tell you that that was my bread and butter in terms of violent crime in the Denver office and in the Philadelphia office, was to prosecute prior felons found in possession of guns. I've since brought more than $7 million to Delaware County and the city of Philadelphia to hire more assistant district attorneys to take those prior convicted felon in possession of gun cases out of state court and into federal court, where the sentences are far more severe and there's no parole in the federal system.
So let's say you're elected Attorney General. On your first day in office, what will your priorities be?
My priorities are going to be violence in these large cities. Then it's going to be fraud with respect to online fraud with respect to seniors. And then the third category is, to the extent the Attorney General's office is involved in the corrections side in helping people recover from addiction. That's very important to me. I lost my brother in 2020. To addiction. He was addicted since high school, and I am now very active in the trauma-informed therapy side. We've got a school in my district that's going to try to reopen to try to help young people deal with violence and incarceration in a trauma-informed model. In other words, helping a young person understand their why. Very early on in office in the 160th district, which is Delaware and Chester County, I went over to my county prison in Delaware County, and I was sitting with a group of men who were going through addiction treatment. And I, about an hour into this meeting, asked this question, Phil. I said, do you guys remember the day you started using drugs? I didn't know how bad a question that was of addicts until I got this response from a man who hadn't been saying a word the entire meeting. He said, you're asking the wrong question, and he had a couple of expletives in there when he said it. He said, it wasn't the day I decided to start using drugs. It was the day that my mom's boyfriend raped me. And that changed me forever. That moment changed me forever. And as I was connecting the dots between those men, and they all had a story. They didn't tell me their stories, but they were like, yeah, that was me too. I suffered some trauma that changed the trajectory of my life. And connecting those dots to my brother, never once did I stop and ask him, what happened? What happened? I just assumed one day he started smoking pot, which he did, and that led to all these other harder drugs that wrecked his life. I was a family member of an addict who I believe responded the way many family members do, which is to say, what do we have to do to make you better? What do we have to do to make you stop? And I never asked what happened. So now that's a part of my passion, is helping especially young people who are caught in this violent culture. It's like if we can just take a time out with them and ask them what happened and help them try to deal with that moment in their life, maybe they can change their own trajectory rather than the typical corrections model of the last 50 years, which is, we're just going to keep regulating you into submission and maybe that'll make you better. We know now that that doesn't work. So that's a lengthy answer about the third priority, but it's just very personally important to me that law enforcement and law and order should be absolutely tough on criminals, on violent criminals, and yet have a moment of compassion and empathy on the back end for people who are suffering.
Well, let's take a moment and kind of go back into your childhood. Where did you grow up? What was childhood like?
Yeah, so it's an interesting part of my political dynamic too, is I'm not originally from here. My dad was in the military. We relocated to Alaska in 1978, and they're all still there. So I originally went to Duke University from Alaska, and then myself, I was an active duty military man. So I traveled the world and left active duty in 2000. In 2000, I went to Columbia Law School and got a Master's of Law in Jurisprudence, which is legal philosophy, both in virtue ethics and criminal law. And here's how the Colorado and Pennsylvania piece comes together. I then go to a judicial clerkship in Atlanta for the Chief Judge of the 11th Circuit, who I'm still in touch with and love dearly. And about halfway or a little more through my clerkship, he comes into my office, sets his coffee mug down, and he's like, "I'm a little worried about you." And I was like, "Judge?" Now this is a man who could walk off a movie set of being a federal judge, in the early 2000s. Flat top, bow tie, handsome as can be. He's like, "It's time for you to get married, settle down, have some kids, and run for office." And I was like, "Okay." He's like, "I'm telling you that because you have 3 job offers from Washington, D.C. Nobody's from Washington, D.C. You got to go to Washington from somewhere else." So I pulled off of those job offers and landed in Denver, Colorado, where I assumed I would make my forever home. I was in the Department of Justice, U.S. Attorney's Office, doing violent crime there, and then fell in love with a Philadelphia girl. And as they used to say, now you know the rest of the story about why I live in Pennsylvania. So I took those orders back to be Deputy Legal Counsel to the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, to be closer to Philadelphia, and then ended up in the Department of Justice in the U.S. Attorney's Office in Philadelphia.
Well, let's take a look at a few of those different things. So let's go back to your undergraduate years. What did you major in and why?
Yeah, I was a public policy major. I actually started in biomedical engineering, and after a year of engineering, I was done with that. My son is actually at Duke right now as an engineering senior, and he's going off into the nuclear Navy to be a submariner. And it was while at Duke that I went from Navy ROTC to transitioning into the Marine Corps.
Why the Marines?
I could see the landscape starting to unfold in the Navy ROTC program across the country, and the likelihood was that I was going to be driving ships, and I wanted to do something with fighting, and that was where my spirit was taking me, and so I went into the Marine Corps with designs on being an infantry officer, but then the opportunity to go to flight school presented itself, and I took it.
At what point in your career did you decide on pursuing the law?
Great question. I think it was actually at Duke. In my public policy major. So at the time that I majored in public policy at Duke, I believe it was one of 2 programs nationwide. Now it's very common, but at the time it was unique, and I loved it. I just absolutely loved studying issues, economics, and trying to blend that into a policy recommendation. So I believe that it was eventually in the cards, right? I went to flight school with the knowledge that, not being an actual pilot, being the flight officer, the guy controlling the weapon systems in the back, that it probably wasn't going to be a career for me. So when I was in Pensacola, Florida as a flight instructor, I applied to the Marine Corps Law Education Program and was accepted. And that program was to allow you to go full-time to law school, pay you your salary, but you paid for law school. So the University of Florida gave me in-state tuition. I wrote them a check for $1,500 every semester, and then suddenly I was off to become a judge advocate in the Marine Corps.
What was that experience like? What's it like being a prosecutor within the military?
That's a great question because it's somewhat like A Few Good Men and yet not at the same time. There aren't many high-profile trials that involve a Marine colonel. I describe it to people like this. A Marine Corps base is a microcosm of society, right? The crimes that you find in the outside world also happen on a Marine Corps base. So with some adders, right? Like you can't try somebody for missing their job in the civilian world, but you certainly can in the military. And we had that, a lot of unauthorized absence, a lot of drug possession and drug use cases as well that you wouldn't have in the civilian world. But it's otherwise very much the same. And I often recommend to people who have an interest in the law, do it in the military. Because the first thing that happens when you're a judge advocate in the Army, Air Force, Navy, Marines, Coast Guard as well, is you're in the courtroom almost immediately, trying cases before a jury. It's some of the best law practice out there and some of the best trial by fire that you'll get.
Sounds like you like that.
I loved it. I absolutely loved it.
You were also legal counsel for the Joint Chiefs of Staff.
Yep.
What does that mean? What kind of work did you do?
Yeah. So the chairman of the Joint Chiefs basically has a personal staff of varying different functions, and one of them is the legal counsel's office to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. We also serve most of or all of the admirals and generals on the joint staff that serve the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. But I was the chairman's personal ethics lawyer. So for General Myers and General Pace, if they had an ethics question, it came to me and I provided them direct advice. There were, I think, 7 or 8 of us in the legal counsel's office, and the entire waterfront of law was divided amongst us. So, for example, all the detainee litigation coming out of Guantanamo was on my desk. Everything going on in federal court relative to Abu Ghraib was on my desk. But the main of it was giving ethics advice to the chairman, the vice chairman, and the generals that were on the joint staff.
Now, you also served in the Joint Terrorism Task Force. Was that something you did? You leave the military and go do that?
Yes. So that was, there were a couple of different instances of that. I had some investigative roles when I was on the chairman's staff with the JTTF. I believe it was in New York at the time. And in the context of Philadelphia, I was one of the terrorism prosecutors. My wife, ironically, took that position. She was in the U.S. Attorney's Office also and eventually became the United States Attorney. And she took on that role, and it grew over the post 9/11 days in a way that it didn't exist when I was there. When I was a Joint Terrorism Task Force prosecutor, it was about finding problems before they were problems and solving them, often by using things like illegal immigration crimes and convicting them of that and getting them out of the country.
What is it like to be an attorney going from the military to a civilian world?
So that wasn't really my trajectory. My trajectory was going from the military into the prosecution world in Department of Justice, and that actually wasn't that big a transition. The transition was in dealing with non-uniform defense counsel, but that went just fine as well. I mean, that bar, you tend to treat each other well enough that it's a good practice. The transition for me was from Department of Justice and having been a congressional candidate in 2008 into the civil world, and that was a transition, right? I mean, it's a lot of meetings and a lot of collaboration and consensus building, and that took some adjustment, but I think I did pretty well.
Now, you're currently a member of Pennsylvania State House. When did you decide to run for office?
I ran for office in 2020. So as I referenced a couple times, after living in Delaware County for all of about 18 months, the Republican Party came to me and asked me to run for Congress, which I did. And then that congressional run is what led to me finding energy as a new passion of mine, and I ended up practicing energy law for the next 10 years. In 2020, my state representative announced that he was not going to seek re-election, and I was concerned, quite honestly, that we were going to lose the seat if I didn't run or someone like me didn't run. So I stood up and ran for my community, and won election that year by 600 votes, and then won re-election 2 years later by 1,500 votes.
Do you like being a state legislator?
I do. There are parts of it that are frustrating. I tell people all the time, they say, do you like the job? And I said, well, you have to narrow the question as to what job you're asking me about, because there's the Harrisburg legislative job, there's the district office helping people job, and then there's the you never stop running for office job. So it's a campaign, a district job, and then a legislative job. And I like them all very much for different reasons. I like the battle of campaigns a lot. I get most of my gratification from helping people back home. And I'm told, I used to be on the Aging and Older Adult Services Committee, and I'm told that my district has more senior living communities per square mile than any other district in the state. So I've got a constituency that has needs, and I get to help them a lot. We're just coming out of circulating petitions for re-election, so I've been in a lot of living rooms, getting signatures from people, and it's just the number of folks that I run into knocking on their door that I've actually helped in some way. It's not me, it's my staff too. It's really, really rewarding. And then, of course, the pugilism of trying to get law made. It's fun, it's rewarding, it's frustrating at times, but I expected the frustration, and the ability to navigate the halls of the House and work with both sides of the aisle, I find to be a fun challenge.
How would that experience inform your performance as Attorney General?
Yeah, I think because of that experience, I'm uniquely qualified. I'm uniquely qualified because I know what it takes. The easiest thing to do, Phil, is to come into the room and say, I'm right, and I know what to do, and we're going to do it my way. That's the easiest thing to do, and yet it never works. Because you've got a lot of bright people sitting around the table with their own unique ideas who need to be heard, who need to be factored into the equation. And that process in Harrisburg, while unpopular outside of Harrisburg, is a necessary one. So, for example, what were we, 6 months late in getting the budget out this last year? Because we had a process that began with, I'm right, you're wrong, and this is the way we're going to do it. And it's like, well, no, until we all get at the table and have some input on what the final product's going to be, then you don't have a final product. I hope we learned that through the entirety of last year's calendar year so that we don't repeat that mistake now. You asked about the Attorney General's office and my experience relative to the House. That's it, right? The Attorney General and the Governor have a relationship, sometimes adversarial, sometimes not. When it's from two different parties, it will at times be adversarial. But at the end of the day, it's got to be about the Commonwealth. And having that wealth of experience and having negotiated in the House of Representatives and negotiate from the House with the Senate and with the administration is invaluable. And like I said, there aren't many of us on the ticket that have that experience.
Are you running for re-election to your State House seat and running for Attorney General at the same time?
I am now. And I say it that way because we have to see what the outcome of the primary is going to be. But that's my intention for now.
Talk about your campaign. How are you campaigning? Are you traveling around the state? What are you doing?
Yeah, I spent a good part of last year traveling the state and meeting people, especially on the political side. But one thing I did not do during 2023 is announce my campaign and step on the judicial elections, because that was very important to me. What I did instead was 2 weeks after this last year's election was over, I announced then. So our campaign is only, a month and a half old. Notwithstanding that, I've been to all four corners of the state. I started in Erie and Warren County and worked my way all the way up to Pike and Wayne and then back home. It's been a really interesting experience. And what I've discovered is that what I see on the evening news is in literally every quadrant of the state. People are upset. They're politically motivated, a little mad, and rightfully so. And their choices haven't been what they want them to be, which is why I'm continuing to run.
You say they're upset. What are they upset about?
They're upset about the economy. They're upset about lack of leadership, and I'm talking on the national stage at this point. They're upset about the border. They're upset about the fact that they can't go to these major cities without feeling like they're going to die. They want to see leadership. And I tell them that routinely. It's like, I think what we're all hungry and thirsty for at this point is that leader that's going to step forward engage the state, engage the everyday family in a way that makes them feel like there's a future for them, that they're safe, that they can raise their children in an environment where they have some control over their education and the trajectory of their life. They want their lives back. We want to return to the glory days of the Reagan years.
Now, the state Republican Party endorsed Dave Sunday for this position. The Philadelphia Inquirer says that making an endorsement earlier than usual was an effort to avoid a messy primary election in this year's highest profile state level race. What did you think about that endorsement?
Yeah, they didn't get that, did they? There's going to be a primary. And it's interesting, the day that I announced, or the day after I announced my run for Attorney General, I got a call from the state party chairman saying, I know we're supposed to have a winter meeting that's during petition period. We're going to back it up 2 weeks, and there's going to be no in-person meeting. We're going to do the whole thing virtually. And then that's somewhat what I encountered being out on the trail after that, trying to campaign for the endorsement, was a process that was largely already locked down. We had some meetings, we had some interviews, but you can feel the room when you walk into it. Right, so I pulled out of that process and said, I'm moving on. And part of the rationale for pulling out of that process is I was able to hire Mark Campbell. And I don't know if you know that name, but Mark Campbell ran the Glenn Youngkin gubernatorial race and won. Ran the Ted Cruz for president race, and has run many congressional races and down ballot issues. Flew in from Texas to help me get the campaign off the ground, and I was just talking to him earlier today. We have a serious campaign. Dave Sunday's going to have a serious fight.
Have you received any endorsements from other organizations at this point?
Yeah, I've received a number of endorsements from House members and leadership in the House. But quite honestly, right now we're working on getting the petitions done, and then we'll start moving on with the primary process.
How important are endorsements?
I would say that some people look at them as some sort of tap on the shoulder that, you've been embraced by the establishment. But again, I've been all over the state, and nobody is telling me right now what I'm looking to for an answer by way of leadership is what the Republican Party tells me that it ought to be. And in fact, I'm hearing just the opposite. I'm going to have more than enough signatures on the petitions to get on the ballot. And the people that are helping me are inside the party disaffected people. Inside the party disaffected people. We're losing elections. And we're not just losing the election on issues. We're losing the elections because we're craving leadership. And it's not just our party, it's the whole Commonwealth, craving leadership. It's the reason Josh Shapiro has been effective, is he stepped into a void and is, I don't agree with his policies. I don't agree with the manner in which he's going forward with budgets, but he stepped into a void, and I intend to do that on the Republican side and in the Attorney General's race as well.
Talk more about leadership. What are the characteristics of a good Attorney General, and how does that relate to leadership?
I think it ties pretty strongly back to my experience in leadership in the Marine Corps. I rose to the rank of colonel. I ran one of the biggest prosecutor shops in the country, in the Marine Corps, that is. I often say about my parents' generation, our parents' generation, that they were the do-tell generation. I tell you to do something, you go do it. And now our children are very much not of that ilk. And we are the ones that had to bridge that gap of trying to convince people that this is good for them, and what our parents did, which is, I've told you to go do something, now go do it. And I feel like that is the strength of leadership. People want to know that you're in command, in charge, but you're listening also. Just like for voters, right? That you're listening and processing and haven't come to the conversation with such a conclusion that you can't flex a little bit to work that idea into the final solution. That to me is effective leadership. When everyone feels valued, the team moves together and accomplishes.
Well, we have just a couple of minutes left. Use that time to tell voters why they should vote for you.
Yeah, it's pretty simple. So, we're going to have 2 elections, a primary and a general election. My policy issues are this. We didn't talk about the impeachment of Larry Krasner. When we move forward with that impeachment, or later in a possible criminal investigation, I am going to be working on violence in these large cities, day in and day out. We're going to get concurrent jurisdiction. We'll descend with 1,000 Attorney General's agents, and we'll prosecute the crimes that these progressive DAs won't. In the Republican primary, I'm the only real Republican in this race. Dave Sunday's been a Democrat for 37 years of his life. Voted for in the Barack Obama election. I didn't do that. I am the only candidate in this field that is a dyed-in-the-wool, hardcore law and order prosecutor, and I'll keep people safe.
We've been speaking with Craig Williams, a Republican candidate for Pennsylvania Attorney General. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you.